So I'm going to introduce a couple of tips now that you can do when calling methods in C#, and this is to do with passing the parameters in. I'm going to talk about what's called named parameters and also optional parameters in C#. So let's look at this example here. It doesn't really do much. I have a sample method. It takes in various parameters, all of different types. So we have a video game object, a couple of numbers, a string, and also a boolean. Inside the method, we're just outputting the title property of this game object, which we specify up here in the constructor. Next, we're adding the two numbers together and displaying the result. And finally, we have a condition. If the value of this boolean variable is true, then we're outputting the message here. So it's a bit of a gauntlet of tasks. It doesn't really have any purpose in the real world. It's just for the purpose of this example. And when we call the method, you can see we're setting up a new object here, and then we're calling the method passing in that object and also the remainder of the parameters. So when I run the program, you can see it pretty much does exactly what it says. So far when calling methods, we've been calling these methods with the parameters in order which they appear. So the game object is first, we pass in the game first, followed by num1, num1, num2. So you can see all in order which they're specified. So by using something called named parameters, we don't need to specify the parameters in order. So let's take a look at an example of that right now. Say I want to switch the position of these two parameters here, hello, and also the boolean true. So now I want to specify the boolean first. What we do, we take the name of the parameter here and prefix it with a colon, just like that. So we're going to specify that first, and now we're going to specify the message afterwards, and we do exactly the same thing. We take the parameter, we add the colon, and then its value. So now I've traded the ordering of these two parameters. And in order to do that, I have to specify the name of the parameter, just to tell the system, which one belongs to which one. And we just suffix that with a colon here. So when I run the application now, we have exactly the same result. So these are named parameters. So you can see we only changed the order of the last two parameters. The first three remain in the same order, so that we don't need to give these a name because they're in the same order. However, if I want to name my first parameter and put it somewhere entirely different, then I'm going to have to name every single parameter, otherwise we're going to get an error here. So in this case, I don't need to name the first three because they're in the exact same order from the start. But if I move this game all the way to the end, for example, and give that a name, so it'll look something like this, then I'm going to get this error, and that's because I need to prefix everything else with the name. And now you can see the error has been resolved because game has been moved out of position, and that was the very first one. Therefore, there's no ordering at all, so they will all need a name in this case. So that's the power of named parameters. But why is it useful? Well, you could argue it improves readability. You could say from the actual call itself, assuming this method was locked away in a different class or a different file, so you only have this visibility on your end. You can clearly see, look, num1 has the value of this, num2 has this, and it gives you a bit more information about the call. However, it does create a bit more code in your application. Another reason, perhaps a developer is working on this method here, and the method isn't quite finished yet. They have maybe 5 parameters, for example, but maybe soon they're going to add a couple more. And your job as a tester is to test the method. So you're testing the method with these 5 parameters, but you don't know if the developer is going to add more of them later. So what you can do, you can use named parameters here to conduct any testing you wish to do. And when the developer then adds 2 more, in any order, it doesn't really matter, then you know that your parameters aren't going to be passed into different ones by accident. For example, if the developer then adds 2 more integer parameters, then we know that num1 and num2 will be 5 and 3 in this case. If the developer adds, 3 and 4, for example, we're not accidentally putting these numbers in those slots. So in cases like that, it's quite useful when you're not accidentally passing parameters of the same type to different parameters. You're literally saying, okay, this parameter called this will receive this value. So that is quite useful. And it's not only methods, you can do this in constructors and a couple of other things as well. So if I go to this video game class where we've specified this parameter to the constructor, you can see the constructor just takes one argument, which is title. So just like when calling methods, for example, I can prefix this with title, and it's going to compile just fine. So we're not limited to method calls with named parameters like these. We can also use them in constructors and other things like that. So let's talk about optional parameters now. What does that mean? If you have an optional parameter, then you can give the parameter a default value if no parameter is specified. So for example, let's look at this display message boolean right here. We're passing in the value of true. Let's just say we don't have to pass in a value, but we can if we want to. So what we can do here, we can say, okay, if this parameter isn't passed into this method, display message, then let's just set it to a default value of true. So if the parameter is omitted, it's not there, then when this method then gets called, it's just going to initialize this to true. So if this is true here, it's going to output the message. So we can take a look at that right now to see if that works. So you can see the message is being output. Similarly, if I change this default value to false, then we're not going to see this message at all. It won't say hello, which it doesn't. When specifying optional parameters in C#, they have to go after the required parameters. So for example, if I make message an optional parameter, and I just initialize it to a default value of an empty string like this, you can see I have a little error here. And when I try and compile the application, for example, so if I just set this to true, you can see there's an error. And if we come down here, we can see this error here. Optional parameters must appear after all required parameters. So all optional parameters must come at the end here. And you can have as many as you want. For example, we can make message a default value as an empty string, and also display message as a default value of true. Then we can actually remove these values. We can even go as far as saying, okay, let's initialize these two numbers to 0 if they're not specified. So you can see there, so then we don't need these, for example. But it really does depend on your purpose and what you're aiming to achieve. So if we run the application now, we can see adding the two numbers together is 0 because we're initializing them to 0 because we're not specifying the parameters. So pretty much the only thing we're doing is outputting the title of the video game here. So when we actually call this method here, if we look at the parameter list now, you can see there's a bit more extra information here. It requires a video game because this is a required parameter. However, you can see optional parameters now have these square braces around, and it also gives you the default value, 0, 0, an empty string, and also true. So it does give you some feedback on what is required when trying to call this method as well. So you can see how these optional parameters are represented when trying to call your methods. And again, you're not limited to method calls with this. Just like before, you can use these in constructors and again some other things as well. Delegates, indexes. So if I set my parameter to the constructor as a default value as an empty string, then I no longer need this value because it's optional. And when we run the application, we're just going to get an empty string. You can see there's no game title because the default value is an empty string. So this is the power of named parameters and also optional parameters in C#. It opens up things to a whole new realm of possibilities. So I hope this tutorial helped you, and happy coding.